I want to talk about Ukraine's long-range Flamingo FP5 missile. So, the Flamingo is named because originally it's actually was a pink missile when it came to it being like tested and then making models in Firepoint's factories. Firepoint being a Ukrainian defense company that has gotten quite a lot of contracts. Whether or not it should have gotten those contracts, exactly how they got those contracts, don't focus on that, okay? Focus on the shiny big missile. Big missile. And it's got like 2 letters. Then it's got like a number. Like, big missile, big muscle, go boom, go blow up Russia. Now, for a while, this is how it was talked about, where people were nervous about where the money exactly, we don't have a result yet. We keep hearing about a ballistic missile program, about a cruise missile program. We keep hearing about how the Ukrainians are going to be able to throw this missile at the Russians. And then we hear Firepoint basically advertising themselves in the way that they're giving these estimations for how many missiles they're going to be able to produce. Oh, we'll be able to produce dozens and dozens, and before you know it, we'll be able to produce hundreds and hundreds. And if you would have listened to what Firepoint was saying about the resources at their disposal and what they expected to hit when it came to production numbers as they were trying to attract more investment capital, you would believe that Firepoint would be able to throw like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 of these babies at the Russians like every day or something, or at least every other day. Now, that is not where we're at, right? We're talking about something like 3 to 5 to 6 to 7, maybe like once or twice a week, maximum, more likely once a week. And that's also with a bunch of drone swarms, which is doing the majority of the heavy lifting and stretching out Russia's air defense systems. Now, this isn't a hard science, I'm telling you, when it comes to the numbers of how many of these are being thrown. I'm just saying when it comes to what Firepoint, the Ukrainian defense company, was saying to the investors, and what I got the pen out for to make my point, what they were saying to the investors and what actually happened when it comes to, the impacts that actually were made, there's a big gap. There's a big difference. Now, I understand that Ukraine right now has a capital shortage, meaning that the Ukrainians could continue to expand drone production and to expand production of a lot of their industries, but they simply need the inflow of capital. Part of the reason why they made those deals, as difficult as they were, to move experienced Ukrainian air defense personnel to the Middle East, to make these defense deals with these companies, to allow these Ukrainian defense companies to export weapons when they need those weapons desperately inside the country. These decisions were made thinking about the long-term economic health of Ukraine and the long-term defense health of the country, as they could allow more Middle Eastern capital to be flowing into these Ukrainian defense companies, expanding production, and allowing more drones to get from the factory line to the battlefield, even if it meant some of those drones in certain durations might have to get diverted to foreign suppliers, or like to foreign supplies, to other countries who have purchased them. They needed that inflow of capital. And I think Firepoint also was subject to these same conditions and were saying what was necessary to get that inflow of capital. But now we're here. We're not just talking about Flamingo models, FP5 demonstrations, or test flights, or test this, test that. Here's this model, that model. Oh, we're going to be around this day or that day. We are seeing these Flamingo missiles be used now for months, right? And now we're seeing the frequency of their use increase. Now we're not seeing an increase in rapid number as if 100 just got off and they can use 100 missiles over the next month and then move on to the next 100. No, they're nowhere near those types of production numbers. But the production numbers, if we believe they're going from the factory to the, to deployment, and we're assuming that they're not storing a ton of these slowly over time from one massive attack, and we assume that the rate of their usage is somewhat at least tied to their production numbers, production is upscaling. Probably not at the speed that Zelensky would want, but still fast enough that the Russians don't like the speed at which they are scaling. And that means we're seeing Flamingos being used at higher frequencies. And this is just one example that Zelensky posted, that the Defense Department of Ukraine posted, and I'll read what Zelensky said about it. then we'll play the video, and then we'll play some footage of Russians reacting to it. We continue to apply Ukrainian long-range sanctions, which is Ukraine's very interesting way of describing their long-range strike campaign, not as just, hey, we're blowing this up or blowing that up. This is how we sanction and stop the invasion. Long-range sanctions against, and it's also targeting like the Russian energy industry and basically the profit mechanisms by which the Russians fund the war. That's why they call them long-range sanctions. We continue to apply Ukrainian long-range sanctions against Russian military factories and the oil industry. In particular, last night, Ukrainian FP-5 Flamingos struck a military plant that supplies the occupiers' army with components for drones and missiles. I thank the armed forces of Ukraine for their precision. An oil refinery in the Samara region was also hit last night. The distance from the front line is more than 900 kilometers. I am grateful to the warriors, to the Special Operation Forces, the Unmanned Systems Forces, and the Defense Intelligence of Ukraine. The entire just response of the security servants of Ukraine also reached 2 oil infrastructure facilities in the Vladimir region at a distance of 700 kilometers. I thank everyone who fights and works for Ukraine. Here is the footage that they posted of these missile attacks. Now you can see these are cruise missiles that are flying relatively. In this one, you can see it. I'll show you in a moment. You can see how low this one's. Look how low it is flying. How low it is flying. It is flying low and it is flying slow. And that's something you can take from this video. Low and slow. Now, of course, it's faster than your car, but when it comes to, you know, this cruise missile speed, it can go faster. They can make the Flamingo go faster. They're going low and slow to prioritize the distance. When you go low and slow like that, the cruise missile can go further. Of course, by going low and slow, you increase the likelihood that you can be intercepted or shot down if there are air defense systems in the region. But if there's no air defense systems in the region, or you overwhelm the air defense systems with drones, or the air defense systems were not ready when you passed by, they were not alerted because you don't have the radar systems working, whatever it is, if it gets past you, it gets past you and it strikes. And so by getting to 900 kilometers, the Ukrainians flew low and slow and were able to still get through Russian air defense systems, Russian defensive structures, and strike the factory. And when I say strike the factory, I do not mean they slightly struck the factory. It shows it here. They did heavy damage. You can see it right there. There's also some photographs online where you can see the damage done. But this is interesting for a few reasons. The low and slow suggests to me that despite the fact that the Ukrainians don't have a lot of these flamingos to go around and they are choosing their targets very selectively, that they believe that in certain directions that the Russian air defense systems have been so overstretched that they don't have to prioritize speed and a lack of interceptability or a less likelihood of interceptability, and they can go low and slow, prioritize distance to get targets that otherwise wouldn't be within range. But because they have stretched out the Russian air defense systems, where they're having to replace destruction in Crimea, they're having to replace destruction now due to the mid-range strike campaign in southern Ukraine, which is not only straining logistics, but is also straining radar systems and air defense systems, because they're also having to protect, replace air defense systems that were destroyed by a long-range, one-way attack drone campaign by the Ukrainians, because they have to cover so much more ground now, where Russia's size as the largest country on the planet is now a detriment when it comes to air defense, because before, the Russians didn't want Ukraine to have missiles that could go over 125 kilometers. Well, now these strikes, just these strikes, hit factories over 900 kilometers. And the reason they didn't want that is because they know Russia is extremely large, and if they lose a lot of air defense systems, they're not going to be able to protect all of Russia. They're going to have to make very difficult decisions about whether they protect the key, the Moscow area, and, the decision-making centers and the Muscovite population around there, or they protect oil refineries that are more economically useful, but maybe not as useful for when it comes to public consciousness, morale, the image of the state, the image of Putin's control on the situation. Whether they protect the St. Petersburg area, they protect the coastline there and the naval assets there, or they're going to be protecting refineries that are deeper, even past Moscow, as some of these strikes have been conducted past Moscow. You guys remember the hand-wringing? You guys remember the hand-wringing that if the United States gives Ukraine Tomahawk cruise missiles, if the United States gives Ukraine long-range munitions that can be used in Russia, or we give them permission to use them in Russia, this could cause World War III. This could cause a thermonuclear winter where the whole world is being launched on fire. This could cause a war with Europe. This could cause a war with the United States. This could spiral. This could escalate. Escalate is the words you heard all the time. Well, now, here's footage of the Flamingo missiles going. Not American, not European, homegrown. This is not as good as an American Tomahawk missile when it comes to speed, or it's less, it's the lack of likelihood of it being intercepted. A Tomahawk has better speed. A Tomahawk is less likely to be intercepted. A Tomahawk is also more precise. It will take more Flamingos to take out a target, despite the fact that its obvious advantage is its massive payload size, because it is a big cruise missile. It will take more Flamingos on average, statistically, to take out a target than an American Tomahawk cruise missile would have. So the Ukrainians have gone to perform the same task, maybe not with the same statistical efficiency, but they've now been able to do it. And what have we found? Hey, if we allow ATACMS strikes in Russia, that will be the red line. Oh, well, if Ukraine invades in the Sudza, that'll be the red line. This will be the red line. That'll be the red line. It seems that a lot of these red lines were really translucent, and that our decision makers, when making choices about where exactly Russia's red line actually is when it comes to the use of atomic weapons, have prioritized their own comfortability over making decisions that will bring a more rapid conclusion to the war and would actually take advantage of or escalation dominance. The fact that obviously the West has high precision munitions. Russia is a very big country. They have to protect a lot of their assets. If you want to bring the war to a halt, you strangle those logistics, you strangle the factories, you strangle the funds for the war, and the war machine, with no men, with no pathway to get to the front, with no way to fund the front, with no way to fuel the front, the war will come to an end. And instead, in order to control escalation, in order to try to stop the situation from spiraling, we have instead allowed the war to drag out into a situation where there are Russian drones slamming into NATO nation states like in Romania, where there's possibilities for Ukrainian drones to be jammed and go off course and slam into Baltic states, or maybe even Finland, or who knows. There are Finnish communities that have been put under air raid siren, and people didn't even know because they were not ready for this scenario, despite how long this war has been going on, whether they should take shelter and or they shouldn't take shelter. And so instead of taking a pathway that could have maybe brought the war to a more rapid conclusion, but would have meant maybe some risk in talking about Russian decision-making and how they would respond, and getting ready for that risk and trying to bring the war to a more rapid conclusion, we instead allowed it to drag itself out. Then we saw that escalation take place anyway, without the United States' involvement, way later down the line, after the United States had essentially abandoned Ukraine when it comes to the aid perspective, and there's no escalation of the war, there's no strikes on European capitals, there is no atomic hellfire, there is none of that. Instead, there is redesigned Soviet rust buckets turned into modern Ukrainian missiles going off of that technology, off of that framework, to attack Russian cities, strain the Russian economy, and we're no closer to World War III. So the question has to be, do we listen to these people who fear-mongered about that? Do we take into account that, yes, there were real risks, but a lot of those risks were sometimes overblown, in part due to Russia's information warfare strategy? Do we acknowledge this? And I think we have to just acknowledge that, You know, Russia's information warfare strategy did kind of poison the dialogue for a bit. That at the end of the day, yes, there are risks that we need to consider when talking about Russia's atomic capacity. But Ukraine being able to strike its refineries and their way of funding the war obviously has not spiraled. And so that calculation was wrong. And once again, those who predicted the war wouldn't happen, you have to readjust. Those who predicted the war would be over in 2 weeks, you have to readjust. Those who predicted that this would be the red line for World War III, just like Sudza and the invasion over into Russia would be the red line. You have to readjust your framework. You cannot just say, oh, okay, well, let's move the red line like another inch. Every time you move the red line another inch, yeah, you might be right, but you also haven't reframed your thinking. You haven't reframed your thinking so that you won't run into the same problem when dealing with other wars or with this war in the future. Here is Russians reacting to the Flamingo, which seemed to be the main air defense tool at their disposal, was Blyat. All we are seeing is the war returning to its home.